Okay, welcome back, everybody. So let's talk about Hellenistic art. To understand Hellenistic art and philosophy and stuff like that, I think it's good to understand, the sort of mood of the time. Talked about this idea of things being really chaotic. Basically, if there's all these wars going on all over the place, and you might not even know, who you're fighting for, things are going to feel risky and kind of frightening and unstable. And so I think that's a sense that we can sympathize with. At the same time, there's a lot of trade, there's a lot of new connections, there's a lot of new ideas. And so what you get basically are these artists and scientists and scholars all going to the kingdoms of these different kings. This king wants to have prestige and great artists and scholars, so he'll pay for them, whether that's the Ptolemies or the Attalids in Pergamon or any of them. They compete to have the most prestige, the most knowledge. So it's a great time to be a scholar or a scientist or an artist or a storyteller. Everybody, there's lots of opportunities to have somebody be your patron, basically. And if we think about the themes, the big themes that we see in the art are things like, what do we do about a chaotic world where there's a lot of suffering? How do we try and figure out the world? So keeping on going from what the Greeks had been doing previously. But also in contrast to that, where have we messed up? Are our values relative? What is our relationship to the world beyond Greece? Do we believe the things that we used to believe, or do we believe other things now? And do we challenge old ideas? And there's a movement away from just making statues of heroes and gods towards making statues of ordinary things, ugly things, surprising things. There's also an interest in surprise because everybody's kind of explored the traditional way to do things in art. The sculptors had figured out a lot, and they'd figured out the architecture of temples using this sort of very rational way of figuring things out. So now, if you've kind of maxed out your rational strategies, where are you going to go next? It might be trying to play around and catch people off guard, and also to try and figure out what you don't understand and what is uncomfortable to you. So we're going to see this in their art. One example is the Temple of Apollo at Versailles. So this is, these themes were already kind of going on even before Alexander, because this temple is from the year 400. But we see some really interesting evolution here. Notice how the columns here, unlike these columns outside, they're not just straight columns. They're weirdly coming out of the wall, which is a very strange design for a temple. And right here, where there should be an altar or a statue of the god, we have instead a column. And this is the first Corinthian column. So this is a new style of column that's very florid, has a lot of flowers and things that look like plants coming off of it. And this becomes a really popular style in later Greek time periods. And this temple is the first known example of one, and seems to be standing in for the place of Apollo. So that's some weirdness going into our temple building now. On the other hand, there's a lot of building that's very rational. A lot of new cities are cropping up, and there's a real interest in making things according to a grid plan. Like earlier cities like Athens were laid out just kind of randomly, haphazardly, all kind of spinning out from the central area. And this is true of cities like London in France. They're kind of weird blobs, not grids. But when you're trying to be really rational, figure things out, and you start building new cities in a time period where you're thinking about this, you might start using a grid plan to make sure everything's very organized. So you almost developed in all these new cities a standard set of things, like you'd have a temple, you'd have a gymnasium where people can wrestle and exercise, you'd have a theater where people can go to watch plays, maybe a racetrack too, just all these standard things, and then you'd have it laid out according to a grid plan. And in this particular city, we see a Temple of Athena that's really interesting. The Temple of Athena is all based on 1-to-2 ratios. So everything is twice as big as the last thing. 1-to-2, 1-to-2. It's all very cleverly figured out and shows, whereas some people were going in the direction of trying to be weird, some people were trying to go in the direction of to use these sort of mathematical ideas and be very precise and very logical. Another one of the weird ones is the Temple of Apollo at Didyma. This was a temple that had a courtyard in the middle of it. And you would go through like this dark chamber and then come out into the light, which is the courtyard that we see where these guys are standing. So that would have been, a very emotional experience. This is from around the year 300, so after Alexander. This was a different perspective to have a temple that was open to the sky. And of course, Apollo's the sun god. So you go on a journey back into the sun. That's a cool idea. But this is, again, very different from what temples had been doing previously. Okay, if we're being different in temples, how about in statues? So actually, yeah, here's two views for you because I've rearranged the PowerPoint in a weird way. Here is a statue we found from the 300s. This is known as the Antikythera bronze because it was found in a shipwreck near Antikythera. And look at this guy. This is a statue that is like reaching towards the viewer. I wish I could replicate the effect, but it's already kind of weird to have my hand in front of the camera, right? But this guy is doing something weird. And if you were to see this statue in real life, you would like be walking around it. And every different direction you looked at it from would give you a different view. His leg is also twisting a bit more, like his torso is more to the front and his legs to the, kind of making his body curve around there. So it's quite different from what we saw with statues previously. Now they had perfected poses. They had done a lot with making things realistic, but this statue really wants to exist in a three-dimensional space, whereas the other ones were designed to be viewed from the front or from a few angles near the front. This one is almost to make you walk around and look at it at different angles with the hand reaching out like that. Another great example of a statue like that is the marathon athlete. This guy's got his hand way out there. And then he's also looking at something. Maybe he's like looking at his victory wreath or something like that. Oh no, he's already got wearing that. So who knows what he's looking at. But I'm sure people have ideas. But yeah, again, that use of three-dimensional space is like, that's where we're going to go from here, is we're going to make things three-dimensional and kind of engage with the viewer a bit more. At the same time, there's also further developments in the study of how to make statues look really naturalistic. The guy for I'm blanking. But we had the guy for the original canon of Greek statues. Yeah, that was a guy named Polykleitos, however you want to spell it. In the 300s, we get a guy named Praxiteles who takes things further. This is his statue of Hermes and baby Dionysus. There's a story about that. Yeah, it's more of a frontal view statue, but there's a little bit of interest with looking at the baby's face there. And he makes the statue just a little bit more realistic than they were able to achieve before. If you compare these two statues, if you compare Praxiteles over on the right to Polykleitos over on the left, Praxiteles looks a little bit more realistic. And basically, Polykleitos had the idea of 1 to 6 head to body. Praxiteles rewrites that to be 1 to 7. So the head is just a tiny bit smaller and looks a bit less cartoony. And so uses that kind of idea to make his statues more realistic. Praxiteles is sort of the big name here in this time period. He is the rock star of sculptures in the 300s and 200s. Another famous one of his was Aphrodite of Cnidos. And this is one that was designed to be, we know it was designed to be viewed in a rotunda, so you would actually look at it from different sides. And the story goes that the city of Kos asked him to make a statue of Aphrodite for their temple. And he made this one, and they said, "Oh no, that's too sexy, that's too much, too over the top. We don't want it." They said, "Okay, I'll just sell it off to the highest bidder," and it went to Cnidos instead. And yeah, if you look at this, what was the big rule over Greek female statues? They can't be naked, right? Like Greek female statues wear their clothes, but male statues don't wear their clothes. And it's weird here. But we think this is actually maybe a sign of women's rights increasing in Greece, in that there's less emphasis on women being clothed and preserving their virginity all the time. There's still some, but now people are a little more casual about things and not so freaked out about this sort of, women have to be very tightly controlled. Um, the statue also has a legend that somebody stayed in the temple overnight, and in the morning they found a huge stain on the backside of the statue. That's the story anyway. Who knows if it's true? Another another artist of this time is Skopos. Believe it or not, this is supposed to be a male god. So the way that men are being depicted in art gets a lot more androgynous at times, not always, but sometimes. Scopas has this sort of intense expression in the eyes compared to the calmness we saw in something like the Doryphoros. Emotion is coming into the statues in a bigger way, and this statue is all about desire. And one more sculptor I want to mention is Lysippos, who sculpted a portrait of Alexander that became the model for future portraits of him later on. Alexander said he was the only one he wanted to make sculptures of him. And it shows him as a handsome young man, kind of looking slightly off into the distance. That becomes the way you depict Alexander the Great in art, looking off into the distance with his head slightly turned. Another great one for the three-dimensional stuff, and then another one by Lysippus, is known as the Scraper. So this is actually three different copies of this statue we're looking at here. A lot of these statues, we actually know them because the Romans made copies of them. So we saw, them duplicate over and over again. But that's actually pretty helpful for our purposes. So different parts of them are missing different body parts. Basically, this is a guy scraping dust and oil off himself after a wrestling match. This is how Greek athletes would work. They would be covered in dust and oil and sweat, and then they would scrape it off, and then they would sell it in little bottles as like a home remedy. This is another one of the three-dimensional stuff, because look how different it looks when you look at it from different angles here. All right, and here's another weird statue for you, just going in a completely different direction. This is the Farnese Hercules. So here's a sketch of it from the back that shows what it looks like from the back. And look just how bulgy his muscles are. This is like a Incredible Hulk type or like a movie buff type, just incredibly exaggerated and over the top. He's not the handsome young men that we saw who were like a little bit beautiful, but not like all the way androgynous. They've moved away from that art style and are going in different directions now. And one of them is to get this very sort of burly bodybuilder type of guy. And this is Hercules being depicted. And he seems tired. He seems kind of more human. He's slouching over because he's exhausted from his labors. Whereas an earlier statue might have shown that he was perfect. He was immortal and beautiful and handsome and stuff. Now we're saying, well, maybe he got tired sometimes. Maybe he was exhausted. This seems to be a popular enough statue that they actually made miniature versions of it, one of which we have here. And it is pretty cool. Like most of these statues, you can still see them in museums today. Here's another one that changes the game in quite a bit. This is the old market woman, or sometimes known as the old beggar woman. Look at what's going on with her. She is pretty different from anything we've seen before. First off, she's old. We haven't seen that in Greek statues very often. She's at least, old or at least middle-aged. And she kind of seems a little bit messy. Her breast is falling out of her tunic there. So she may not be altogether there. Some people have called her, said that she's supposed to be ugly. It's kind of hard to say because the nose just kind of chipped off. But she's not supposed to, she isn't at least, a young, beautiful woman. So there is supposed to be maybe some interest in catching the viewer off guard with a statue like this and maybe surprising people. It seems like people were interested in statues that went in that direction during this time period. And she's kind of struggling. She has like a basket of food or flowers or something like that. and maybe going to or from the marketplace. And so she's very human. She's very normal. She is not a goddess as far as we know. She's just an old lady that you might see in the streets of Alexandria. And we see plays talk about old ladies in the market and things like that too. So it seems like we're trying to think about human beings and not just gods. At the same time, that idea about ugliness or surprise or discomfort may also be very important here. One of these things you see a lot in the Hellenistic world is tiny, what they call grotesque statues. These weird sort of twisted little dudes, sometimes with like big private parts, just to kind of unsettle, or sometimes they're thought of as good luck charms that keep away evil. That's one of the ideas that's being played around with in this time period. And of course, people really want to keep away evil during this time period. Another one that's all about surprise is the statue of Hermaphroditus. Hermaphroditus was a god who said, I am male to the followers of my father Hermes, and I am female to the followers of my mother Aphrodite. So Hermaphroditus was a god who was in between. And this one shows them reclining on a couch, although actually the couch was added later in the Renaissance. They took a statue and they added a couch to it. Go figure. You might, this is again another thing where you're looking at different angles. You might focus on the feminine qualities if you were looking at them from the front, but you might focus on the masculine qualities if you were looking from the other side. And this is pretty late, but this is sort of the experiments that we see in surprise and sort of engaging with the audience of your sculpture in a big way. And yeah, there's a couple more things I want to mention. One is the altar at Pergamon. So the Pergamon altar to Zeus is very impressive and shows scenes of the gods fighting with the giants. And it also shows the founder of the city. And it's a really great example of an art style that was considered very intense and over the top by later generations. If you look at the way they're doing this here, this is a relief, but it has some of the same qualities as sculpture. Look how deeply it's carved. So you've got the deep details of the folds of the body and the wings and the twists and stuff like that. And all these figures are very twisty and, you know, twisting around. And they have very serious expressions on their faces. They actually have this over-the-top anguish. This one, we would probably be able to see it better if the face hadn't worn away. But like, you know, you can tell just by the eyes that this monster or goddess is anguished. Giant or goddess is you know, intense and suffering. And so is this one over here, this sneaky giant guy. And this is probably Athena who's about to destroy him. So it's very emotional and it's very intense. And the Romans decided they didn't like it at all. And in fact, so did people who were really big on Romans and Athenians. They decided, oh, this art style is terrible, it's bad. I don't think that's true. I think today we can say that it's just an art style. But you know, the Romans and the people who followed them had all these ideas about being noble and being calm and being serious. And in this time period, we're breaking away from that with what they call this Baroque style. Baroque meaning something that like over the top, too much. But today we talk about the Baroque style as this kind of exaggerated style, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Another great example of the Baroque style is Laocoon and his sons. This is a story of a guy who tried to warn the Trojans about the Trojan horse, but the gods made a bunch of snakes come out in the ocean and kill him and his sons. And yeah, again, we have that anguish. The sons look like they're suffering. He looks like he's suffering. They're being killed in sort of dramatic, almost sexual fashion by these snakes. We think actually originally the sons would have been facing different directions. So this would have been another one where it was three-dimensional. But we put it back together wrong, so we just have it put together in this way. But the Romans said this was a bad style, and in fact, one Roman author said art ended in like the year 270 or so, or 370 or something like that. But the Romans brought it back because they really liked the classic Athenian style, and like I said, made lots of copies of those classic Athenian statues. But today, I think we can recognize that there's a variety of different art styles. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is science and knowledge, because the Hellenistic time period, if you like that sort of stuff, this is the time period for you. Okay, but I'm going to stop here, so I will see you in the next video.